Hello and welcome to the Midweek Show with me, Mike Butcher, editor-at-large of TechCrunch. Now, normally I'd be doing a bit of a rundown on the news, but there's a lot of hodgepodge of stuff out there today. Stuff that I picked up was that there's a major crackdown by Twitter, which says it will limit the reach of QAnon content and permanently suspend accounts violating policies, and therefore banning over 7,000 QAnon accounts in the last 2 weeks. If you don't know what QAnon is, it's a crazy conspiracy theory about how the elites are all pedophiles and crazy things like that to do with just Google Hillary Clinton and Pizzagate, and you'll find all sorts of bizarre theories and reports about this QAnon stuff. And now it's amazing, actually, isn't it, that Twitter has taken this long to actually do anything about it? A completely invented, phantasmagorical, bizarre conspiracy theory, and yet it's taken them until 2020 to ban all this stuff. But it looks like that actually they're laying down the gauntlet for other social media such as Facebook. Bangladesh's economy relies heavily on Facebook. I had no idea. Did you know that? I didn't. It's got about 300,000 stores offering F-commerce, so therefore Facebook commerce, and it means therefore that a large swathe of Bangladesh's economy relies on Facebook. Now, while we've been looking at everything to do with disinformation and incursions on democracy, such as Russia and bots and who knows what. In the Western world, in the developing world, Facebook is growing like a weed. And I think it's something that really we should start to take notice of in the next few years. Now, as you know, it's a midweek with Mike Butcher, and I always do an interview with someone interesting, and I hope, and also someone to do with the news. And of course, we can't have ignored the fact that the EU came to a huge agreement this week about reigniting the EU economy, and especially moving it towards a so-called Green New Deal. And so therefore, I am absolutely really excited to be introducing my next interviewee. Now, John Elkington is a pioneer of the global sustainability movement. He's co-founded the Environmental Data Services in 1978 and Sustainability in 1987. He's an author of 19 books. His million-selling book, The Green Consumer Guide in 1988, brought mass attention to the environmental impact of everyday products and brands. John's Cannibals with Forks in 1997 popularized his triple bottom line concept, which became known as People, Planet, Profit, and laid the foundations for sustainable business strategy. Now, today, People, Planet, Profit is a byword for the B Corp movement, which is very much a general movement towards sustainability and things like impact. But he's also founded Volans, a consultancy which works with businesses and governments on these kinds of aims. And now recently, he was the author of Green Swans, which came out only a couple of months ago. Green Swans, a new book, which is very much a new reimagining of some of his ideas. And it's absolutely my pleasure to bring him online today. John, thank you very much for joining Midweek.
Mike, it's a joy, and I'm looking forward to it. And I didn't know that about Facebook and Pakistan, so I'm constantly learning.
Learn something new every day. That's correct. So, to get into it, now a lot of us are familiar with the phrase "the Black Swan," and there was obviously the book "The Black Swan," and you've riffed on that with Green Swans. Now, a lot of us know what the Black Swan is. We've become familiar with the idea. It's this random event coming out of the blue. What is a green swan?
Well, I think a lot of us think that we know what a black swan is. It's been very remarkable in recent times just to see how many people are describing, for example, COVID-19 as a black swan. And the man behind the concept, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, saying, no, it isn't, because some people actually saw this coming, this sort of pandemic. They warned about it quite some time ago. People have riffed off the black swan idea, which came out in 2007, just ahead of the financial crash, in a number of ways. So, for example, people in the financial world have talked about grey swans. Those are things that you can see a little bit more clearly than the black ones. The idea of the green swan is that in some ways, most black swans, at least initially, take us exponentially places that we do not want to go. I mean, they take us into real systemic problems very often. And for example, the current crisis around COVID-19, whether we discuss the labeling or not, is a major systemic crisis. But my question to myself and then to the world was, and what if you could do similar things, develop exponential dynamics, but towards the outcomes that we did want, the future that we do aspire to? And so I started to play with that line of inquiry. I found that there were actually quite a number of green swans out there already. The book came out in April of this year through Fast Company Press. And I've actually been, as you said, I've done 19, now 20 books, and some of them, like the Green Consumer Guide or Cannibals with Forks, really do take off. Most of them don't. This one really has, and I think it's a combination of timing and also the fact that people are now looking for the upsides. They're looking for the, we know enough about the risks and the damage being caused. Now, what do we do about it? Where are the particularly market opportunities?
Well, a lot of discussion in tech is often always about really big companies like unicorns, the $1 billion plus unicorns, the decacorns even. Do you think that we'll see? We've been familiar with the Airbnbs and the Facebooks and the Twitters over the last few years. Do you see unicorns coming out of green swans, shall we say?
It's very tempting to sort of mix up our metaphors into a wonderful fruit salad bowl. But let me say, I think unicorns are clearly a recent phenomenon. They are real. Some of them are a little less real than the entrepreneurs or investors behind them would like us to believe. I do think there is something about the world of the 21st century that is significantly different from the 20th, where it's possible for a Google to go from a standing start to the Google we know today in less than 20 years. And I look at, for example, a business model like Airbnb's, and I could make a case, certainly I could in the early days, for Airbnb being a way of optimizing our use of physical assets, and broadly in an efficiency terms, that's a good thing. But what we're finding with more and more of these breakout business models, and potentially these unicorns as well, is that there are unintended consequences, that Airbnb is now starting to turn the center of some historic cities almost into deserts. People didn't expect that. They didn't project that as an outcome. They've been rather surprised by it. And if I think about unicorns in the sustainability or sustainable transportation space, then clearly Tesla comes to mind. One of the things people are asking us to do is to slap the Green Swans label on companies like Tesla. And what I'm refusing to do, at least at this stage, is to say Tesla is a green swan. It's certainly a unicorn. But and the reason I'm not doing that is because Tesla may still fail. I mean, Elon Musk has been pretty close to the brink a number of times. And when the really big players start to realize the scale of the market opportunity and how fast this is going to go, how fast the market shift is going to come towards electric autonomous vehicles, then Tesla might not have the game all to itself. And it will cause all sorts of unintended consequences of its own. I'll stop there.
Another thing that is obviously interesting about some of your concepts is that you came up with this idea, people, planet, profit, and that became a sort of the byword of the sustainability movement, the B corporations, B as in triple bottom line, with the B, I suppose, being bottom, as it were. Instead of being just about profit and just about shareholder value, you would have to add people or society and planet in there as well. Do you think that sort of moniker is still relevant today? And if it's not relevant, what are we going to replace it with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just very quickly, the B Corporation moniker, as you put it, it's actually around benefit rather than bottom line. And it's technically illegal in the United States to pursue anything other than financial performance for many types of companies. So what the B Corporation movement is doing is saying, hold on a minute. Milton Friedman may have said that was a great thing. We've had 60 years of that. It's proving to be quite flawed in some critical respects. Why can we not have a status for companies which allows them, in fact, encourages them to look at the social and environmental consequences of what they do? So that I think is a really important movement. Sustainability reporting, again, has been built around the triple bottom line, and rating schemes like the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes, where I was involved for the first 9 years, again, triple bottom line. The reason why exactly 2 years ago, through the Harvard Business Review, I recalled the triple bottom line was relatively simple. I think it's done good work. I think it will continue to do good work, but I think in some key respects, it can be misleading. If you think about economic, social, and environmental, value added or destroyed, it puts you in a trade-off mindset. And that was really not the original intent. The original intent was we need systemic change. Capitalism needs to evolve. Economics needs to evolve. And just in the last 18 months or so, you've had people like Mark Benioff of Salesforce, CEO at Salesforce. You've had Warren Buffett. You've had the front page of the Financial Times. All of these people saying capitalism is broken. It's time for a reset. Question now is, how do we go through that process of resetting? And you referenced the EU announcements. I think they're a very important potential stepping stone in that direction.
But aren't we sort of whistling in the wind to expect someone or something or some movement to completely replace the underlying incentives of capitalism? If it's illegal to produce a company that concentrates on anything other than financial incentives in the US and around the world in many other countries, who on earth is going to break the logjam?
Well, the organization behind the B Corporation movement is called B Lab. And what they've done is they've changed the legislation in over 30 American states. So it's no longer illegal to do this. So, and when I say this is a systemic crisis and we need system change to get us out of it, I spent most of my working life working with individual companies and their supply chains and their investors, for example. But what we're now recognizing, unless you change the rules of the game, and that includes valuation processes in financial markets and right out to economics, a lot of this stuff is going to remain exactly as you say. It's going to be a log jam. I think things have changed profoundly. And one of the things I've seen is that, I've worked with CEOs for 40 plus years now. When I first started, they just didn't want to know about this stuff. They'd put their PR or legal people in front of you. Now, you just get through to that board and C-suite level automatically. Of course, they talk to people dealing with this sort of whole change agenda because they know now this is their future and they really want to try and not only get their brains around it sort of in a defensive way, but to begin to ask the question, how strategically and competitively do we play this game so that we come out on top? And that's a big shift, I think.
We've obviously can't ignore the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've all spent the whole planet has spent the last 4 months going through enormous systemic change. But and obviously we're also aware of, we're all working online and Zoom calls, etc. But things are starting to come back to normal. I'm certainly noticing that even though offices are closed, business is starting to come back. And yet, if you look at surveys of populations, especially in the UK, for instance, people actually enjoyed the fact that they didn't have to commute anymore, and there was a real sort of interesting societal change. But in terms of the after effects of the pandemic, as it sort of plays out, as an attempt to kind of go to back to some vague normality. There's clearly a desire to build back differently, perhaps build back greener. What's your assessment of how that is playing out now post this huge, the huge hammer, as the Germans call it, the hammer and the dance, where we've locked down and now we're dancing with this pandemic? What's your assessment of, say, for instance, UK or European governments and how they're playing, where they're going next?
Yeah, look. Of course, business and governments will try and go back to their previous setup as fast as they can, and they have to in a way, because unless we get economic activity back on its feet, tax income is going to disappear, joblessness is going to spread, political pushback, blowback is going to grow and intensify. Absolutely no question about that. But when I talk to CEOs, when I talk to investors, when I talk to people at the very top of businesses now, their sense is something has shifted. Now, if this had happened 10 years ago, it would have been a different story. But it's happened at a time when the climate emergency is increasingly seen to be a reality, where very big political institutions like the European Union are starting to say, as a condition of our investment in business over time, we want to see X, Y, and Z around sort of environmental and social issues, those being addressed. Now, that is a very fundamental shift. So initially, yes, we'll see people scrabbling to put back Humpty Dumpty, and I think largely they will succeed in, for example, getting people back into their offices. But in terms of the status, the priority accorded to some of these broader, people used to call them non-financial issues. I recently heard the phrase pre-financial, in the sense that these social, these ethical, these environmental issues are on the edges of today's system, but they're increasingly pressing in. I think COVID-19 is going to give us the reset that people have been calling for. But the question is, does it take us in the right direction? And just very quickly, we recently completed at Valence a project for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So the top teams of over 200 companies around the world. And one of the parts of that was looking at the impact and implications of COVID-19. And one of the things that was very, very clear, and this came out about 5 or 6 weeks ago, it's online, was that it's almost acted like an X-ray, and people have suddenly seen in real time, in the real world, things that they preferred not to think about. Wealth divides, underinvestment in healthcare provision, in one area after another. And the weaknesses, for example, and you saw it just a couple of days ago in the Financial Times, really big piece, talking about how business schools are now realizing that their mantra of the last sort of 20, 30 years, which has been around efficiency, is deeply, deeply flawed. If you put globalization together with a real pursuit of efficiency and just-in-time supply chains, one thing you drive out is resilience. And people are suddenly realizing that the resilience of our economic systems and our social and environmental systems is absolutely crucial, but it's pretty much been ignored in much of business thinking today. So at that sort of level, I think there's been this sort of, it's not just a tweaking, it combines also with a younger generation of people coming up at every level in business and financial markets. And to some degree, it's not guaranteed, but to some degree, these people do think different. This is their future. This is also their children's future.
Yeah, I can agree. I mean, that until the pandemic happened, we never really thought that the people who delivered our parcels would class as key workers. And yet suddenly they were. I mean, they were absolutely key. People couldn't leave their houses, certainly in the UK. And parcel delivery or any kind of delivery or of anything became a key worker, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that COVID-19 has done very, very powerfully is drive some pre-existing trends in our economies. So digitalization, for example, we've been doing that for 30, 40 years in one way or another, but by God, Zoom and people like that have got a big shunt, and the online retailers and so on suddenly running rings around the bricks and mortar folk. The surveillance economy, you look at these photographs now of people holding what look like guns, scanners to people's foreheads and in airports and so on, and you think, if we'd seen that 3 or 4 years ago, that would have looked like really far-fetched science fiction. It's a reality, and it links into this much broader surveillance state issue. Reshoring, people are beginning to think, and this won't happen overnight, but they're beginning to think, how do we bring back and shorten some of our supply chains? And now things like 3D printing and so on will have over time, I think, a pretty major influence on all of that. But in one way or another, you're getting these shifts being catalyzed and accelerated. There's another one, which is the political one, which I think is severely worrying, which is it's an ugly term, but it's the spread of autocracy. So you look at the EU deal, and one of the big issues is, how do you deal with people like Hungary or borderline Poland, who are starting to go in a different non-democratic direction? And I think COVID-19 could well fuel autocracy and populism. You'd hope that people would spot the pattern where Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the US, Johnson in the UK, all of the populists have singularly failed to get on top of the pandemic. But this could take us either way, I think.
Do you think, though, that sort of shift towards autocracy, and to a lesser extent in the UK, that shift towards so-called independence, is going to be one argument for, I have to say that phrase, the whole crazy phrase, taking back control, as in their argument effectively will be, we'll be able to, address the issues of climate, etc., by more autocratic methods?
Well, it's quite possible that that could turn out in some places to be true, although I think so far the evidence would suggest that rather than taking back control, in the case of the UK, we're actually losing it, and we're putting at risk the United Kingdom itself. We're also missing out, at least potentially, on the upside of the EU Green Deal. We're perhaps missing out also on having to invest at quite that level, and I'm sure we would have been on the side of the frugal five rather than on the high spending folks' side. But I think what's happening now is almost an inevitable symptom and consequence of something much longer term, which is that an old macroeconomic and geopolitical order is breaking down. And I think technology is, again, a really important player in that. We've had 40, 50 years of IT and everything that went with it. So we've now got digitalization everywhere. And that's going to change, we keep being told, but that is going to change everything, and particularly when you factor in artificial intelligence and everything that goes with that. So I don't think people who think that by retreating from WHO in Trump's case, or from the EU and in some part of the UK's case, I don't think that's the way it's going to go at all, because I think what's happening is something that George Orwell predicted, which is the world is breaking up into some very big power blocks, one around China, one around the United States, and one around, very likely, the EU. You can factor in Russia as a spoiler, but and in that world, the fate of independent nations is pretty dire. I think they're going to be squeezed every which way.
Moving to the world of business, and in the book you talk about this concept called the ugly duckling.
Yeah.
Now, in my world, dealing with startups, often that's the sort of the slow grower startup that you don't think's really that interesting, and then suddenly becomes very big quickly. Is that the kind of thing you mean, or are you talking about a different kind of concept?
Well, the thing is that when I think about green swans, I'm largely thinking about market trajectories. For example, the collapsing price of solar and wind power. And that's a market trajectory where the implications for all sorts of incumbent industries are profound. In the midst of all of that, you will start to see people doing stuff that looks seriously weird by today's standards. So everyone knows the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, even I find in places like China and Japan. And so the simple idea there was that there are these things that look really odd, and you wouldn't invest in them knowing what you currently know. And yet at least a proportion of those have the potential to, in the new order, succeed at a quite disproportionate rate. So, for example, another green swan would be the shift towards synthetic meat and synthetic fish, synthetic chicken, synthetic protein. And you've got Beyond Meat and some of these early listings in that space just skyrocketing. Now, I worked for 15 years in the biotechnology industry and through the boom times there. And one of the things I learned there is it's exciting ride, by God it is, but all sorts of casualties come up along the way. And some of the people I would have invested in or supported in one way or another were among the early casualties. So it's going to be an extremely interesting period of our collective history. I think this sort of almost U-bend where the old order comes apart at an accelerating rate and a new one starts to self-assemble will probably go on for something like 12 to 15 years based on historical precedent, which means that by the 2030s, we will be run politically by people we've never heard of. Our businesses will be run by people, again, we've never heard or taken into serious consideration. We're one of those sort of real seismic moments where people talk about shakeouts. This is going to be the mother of all shakeouts.
Do you think that the culture of technology and innovation right now is effectively fit for purpose? Mm-hmm. We're all familiar with the move fast and break things moniker coined by Mark Zuckerberg, but do you think that that attitude is going to be will map to the kinds of solutions that the world needs in the next few years, or should we be looking at how tech culture should address those things?
Well, I think the answer is yes, and I spent quite a lot of time over the decades in places like Silicon Valley, and one of the things I did 4 or 5 years ago when I went through, with the three of us went through to see people like Google X and Singularity University and X Prize Foundation, all these people really, really pushing the boundaries of ambition and technology and the rest of it. Every organization that we visited, I just asked one question: have you ever heard of Thomas Midgley Jr.? Not a single one had ever heard of Thomas Midgley Jr. My response to that was no reason why you should have done at one level, because this was the 1920s, 1930s. He worked for DuPont and General Motors and the other way around. And he had over 100 patents to his name. So he was a very, very successful engineer. But he gave us, for example, leaded gasoline, brilliant anti-knock technology at the time, but it poisoned the nervous systems of millions of young people around the world. He also gave us Freon, so a very major part of the chlorofluorocarbon industry, and they gave us the stratospheric ozone hole. So Thomas Midgley has been described as the single organism in Earth's history which has done most damage to the planet. And yet the people at the cutting edge of these sort of technology-driven booms, in a way, have never heard of him. They've never been, many of them dropped out before they got to business school, but they should know about some of that stuff, because that, as a model, tells you what happens when disruptive technology comes through. There are unintended consequences that no one really predicted. And with the surveillance state, which I referenced earlier on, you're starting to see, do cameras recognize Black people? But there are all sorts of other things that are starting to pop up in that space as well. Should we have thought about that earlier? I think so. Should we be thinking about it more urgently now than we are? I also think so. Will companies like Google and Amazon do it on their own? I don't think so. And therefore, governments have to be very much more actively involved in regulating and trust busting.
But John, you and I know very well that many of these new innovations are powered by venture capital.
Yeah.
And if Oppenheimer hadn't created the atomic bomb with a government, it might have been with a VC many years down the line. In the same way that Mark Zuckerberg was enabled by venture capital to create Facebook, and there are all sorts of problems there with how it seems to be hacking democracy. And how can venture capitalists themselves, and venture capitalists, how do they change their attitudes or pivot what they do to continue to create, shareholder profit, etc., and exits for their LPs, but not cause these unintended consequences, as you say?
Well, there are several ways in which I think people are already in the venture capital world trying to do that. And I've been involved in 3 VC funds over the decades. One of them got trapped in the last downturn, but I couldn't do its exits, and has slightly disappeared since then. But what that one was trying to do was to scan for a wider set of issues that might impinge or accelerate some of the investments they were making. So they would set up an advisory panel of some sort. There's another way of doing it, which is just to get out more. And it's not just venture capital people. When I talk to major business people, it is unbelievable what limited visions and horizons most of these people have. Yes, they see what their competitors are doing. Yes, they can see what the key regulators are doing. Yes, they can see what sort of consumers, customers might be thinking today. But they're not, for the most part, going out to Silicon Valley or to some of the places where the future is starting to bubble up around us. And I've been on a number of trips like that. One, for example, to Silicon Valley, where the chairman of a very large German car company, automotive manufacturer, insisted that they should go to Better Place in the days when Project Better Place was threatening to overturn the car industry. And at the end of that briefing, that chairman, who was really very distinguished character, I mean, he was like a male version of Angela Merkel, came out and saying, not exactly Holy Christ, but actually was overheard to say, fuck, I've been briefed left, right, and center on what the threat that's coming from this world, digital forms of mobility. And I had never really taken it seriously. And suddenly the threat is visceral because I've heard the man behind it. He made him sound a bit like a minotaur, perhaps. But I think getting out more, and it's amazing, I find. If you ask to go and see some of the people who are most powerfully shaping the future, they're really happy to see you, but very often because they know that in 2 weeks they'll be 2 years ahead of you again. So I think get out more, pull in some of the dissenting voices, and just pay attention to some of the ways in which the public mood is shifting. And it was Hemingway who described the gradually then suddenly trajectory in his case in bankruptcy, but that applies with a vengeance in technology terms. So things that look completely like a small cloud on the horizon have a capacity to become absolutely overwhelming and dominant in relatively short order. Just pay attention to some of those smaller clouds. But the challenge then is not to get overwhelmed by the complexity and detail.
I guess it's very true, isn't it, that certainly the investors in innovation often can be very much hidebound by their own bubbles and not break out of those bubbles often enough. And finally, I know that you and Volans is doing a number of new initiatives, not just post-COVID, but also, an ongoing program. You're working on a new initiative, I gather. You've been working with Bankers for Net Zero initiative and also with other kinds of big industries. Something called the Observatory, I gather. What is that, and how will that be working in the next few weeks and months?
Yeah, just very simply, I mean, the Bankers for Net Zero initiative, we don't normally work with governments. I've worked with the EU and so on over time, but we try and work with the private sector and citizen sector too. But increasingly, as I've already indicated, I think the public sector and governments are becoming very much more important. So in the case of bankers, we're saying, if the UK economy in this instance is going to become truly net zero carbon emissions in a sensible timescale, then the banking sector has to support the innovation and the deployment and everything else that goes with that to a much greater degree and much more to a greater degree of sophistication than it currently is doing. And so there we're working with the all-party parliamentary group on fair business banking. So we'll see how that goes, but I think it's an important initiative. The Green Swans Observatory is trying to respond to something that since the book came out, people have said, oh, love the book, but I want examples that are in my sector, in my geography, for a business of my size. I want to know how that relates to particular issues and challenges and opportunities. So what we're then doing with the observatory is linking up with technology networks around the world. We're linking up with universities and business schools. And in fact, I should be on a call just immediately after this with one of those in the United States. And the idea is to scan the world for ugly ducklings, and by implication for lame duck industries, some of the ones that are going to die on their feet unless they really reinvent themselves in short order, but also looking at some of the market trajectories. And we don't want to become a propaganda machine. I mean, we believe in this stuff and we want to communicate, but we want to make sure that where we do recommend the deployment of financial treasure or whatever in support of these sort of objectives and dynamics, that it's well funded. And that's why we're going to universities. That's why we're going to business schools. And just finally, in Japan, for example, we're linking up with Shizenkan University, which is a new university based right in the heart of Tokyo. And they have a business school, and they're positioning that business school as a business school for the 22nd century. And that's a sort of time frame, that's a sort of level of ambition which we're sort of embracing with the observatory. But we'd love to involve the tech crunch world. And Mike, I will certainly be coming screeching back to your front door in search of counsel and advice, if I may.
Well, it'd be a pleasure. But anyway, for now, it's been fantastic to talk to you, John Elkington, the author of Green Swans, and very much an environmental and sustainability pioneer. So thanks very much, John, for joining the Midweek show.
I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much. That was John Elkington there, the author of Green Swans, which is a book that only came out a couple of months ago. So please grab that from your nearest bookstore or online. Thanks very much for joining the Midweek show. You can see all of these interviews archived on mikebutcher.me/midweek. Please subscribe, as they say, on YouTube and Periscope or Twitter, wherever you like. And you can also get an email as well called the Butcher Report, and that's on tinyletter.com/MikeButcher. I'll be back next week again at 3 p.m. London time with another interview. So for now, it's from me, Mike Butcher, and I'll see you next week. Ciao.